Welcome to another episode of the Left of Lansing podcast with Pat Johnston. A progressive insight into Michigan's political and cultural world. And of course, an entertaining podcast designed to shine a light on how to make Michigan's political machine work for the people. Now, from the Left of Lansing headquarters, located in his attic, here's the award-winning Pat Johnston.
Yeah! Welcome to another installment of Michigan's premier progressive podcast. I am Pat Johnston, reminding you...
It's not going to be a cost to you. It's going to be a cost to another country. I heard Kamala the other day, Comrade Kamala, she said, oh, if you do that, he's raising your taxes. No. I'm not raising your taxes. I'm raising China. And all of these countries in Asia and all over the world, including the European Union, by the way, which is one of the most egregious.
The 2024 campaign seems so long ago, and yet it was only 5 months ago when dear leader Trump promised all of us that his Trump tariff con wouldn't cost Americans 1 penny. And you hear how insanely idiotic it was for him to say that across-the-board tariffs wouldn't cost a penny. I mean, because one thing, they are regressive taxes on the working class. But the other ridiculous part is when he said tariffs only raise taxes on other countries. I mean, that is completely idiotic. But what the hell did we expect from someone like this loser, dear leader, who failed at business venture after business venture after business venture? And now he's personally manipulating the market to help enrich himself and those who are willing to do his bidding. And the American working class is paying the heavy price as dear leader enacts extreme tariffs on China and is still using tariffs on countries who are, our longtime allies, while at the same time directing MAGA Republicans in Congress to enact massive austerity programs on the working class by gutting Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security, USAID, public education, food stamps. Oh, and also by raising student loans on those who are trying to pay off for their educations. Isn't that nice, Gen Z? Aren't you so happy about that? I don't know about you, but I'm not really seeing the populism here. Tell me, maybe I'm missing something. I would love to know. Tell me, what am I missing? But you know who isn't missing something? The working class throughout the country. We saw some outstanding numbers of people marching and protesting throughout Michigan and the entire United States last week, thanks to all those hands-off protests. Many of those protests were put together, by Indivisible chapters, like the ones held in Ann Arbor, in Detroit, Traverse City, Central Michigan area, and elsewhere. Last month, I spoke with some leaders from both Indivisible Central Michigan and Traverse Indivisible, and you talk about getting inspirational from talking to those organizers. I mean, these Indivisible chapter organizers, they got involved by getting these chapters started on their own through messaging, connecting, and through hard work. Now, while many in the so-called leadership of the Democratic Party were either absent or asleep or unable to grasp just how quickly we are losing our democracy and our economic footing, working-class Americans alone organized and took to the streets to fight back and lend a voice for the voiceless, while Trump, Elon Musk, the tech bros, Wall Street banksters, and Christian nationalists dismantle the economic safety net of millions of people around the country, while at the same time destroying the democratic fabric this country was founded on. Democrats such as Michigan Senators Alyssa Slotkin and Gary Peters either miscalculated or were just downright ignorant as they treated Trump 2.0 as some kind of a grand moment where we can all find bipartisan solutions and come together as a country. Oh, how nice. They greenlit many of his cabinet picks and voiced hope where they could find some common ground, from the guy who promised that he'd destroy the economy, take a sledgehammer to democracy, and go after his political enemies. I don't know why, but they didn't grasp it for whatever reason, how people in their own state were going to be left on their own, left in the dust, while Trump, Elon, and the MAGA Republican Congress were aiming to destroy this country's working class. But on the good news front, while they were slow out of the gate, these indivisible groups picked up the megaphone left by the Democratic Party establishment and shared that megaphone with millions across the state and the nation. Last week, some 5,000 people showed up in a rally at Lansing, in which some Democrats actually showed up to the rally, and that's a good sign. Some are starting to get the message. Now, here's how progressive activist and good friend of the show, Julia Pulver, described the scene at the hands-off protest at the Capitol in Lansing last weekend, and she posted this on her Blue Sky account.
There are thousands and thousands and thousands of people who have showed up at the Capitol building in Lansing. I can't even get the full magnitude of it. It's so incredibly jam-packed, full of people everywhere.
Julia also posted the following on Blue Sky, and I agree with this. She said, Indivisible seems to be quickly becoming a fifth estate of sorts. The people are becoming our own branch of government in an organized way. Our govs need the consent of the people to exist in peace. We need to take control of our power and this moment. Keep going. Agree, Julia, agree. Thousands in Detroit, Grand Rapids, in the UP, and elsewhere showed up on a not-so-great Saturday weather-wise to show solidarity against Trump and Elon's corporate authoritarian takeover of this country. And these thousands in Michigan and millions across the nation did so basically on their own. As I've stated here before, thanks to Indivisible groups, the people are pushing back, but they're also looking for leaders. And some of these Democratic leaders have been letting us down, and that's why you're seeing Indivisible having to lead the way. Now, we do have some really great, strong, progressive Democrats out there who are trying to fight, like State Representative Carrie Reingans from Ann Arbor, for example, or another progressive Democratic State Representative, Betsy Kafia, up in Traverse City, who was also part of the Indivisible group in Traverse City when it got started during Trump's first term, tweeted the following this week, and I'd like to share it with you. And Representative Kafia said, "Normalizing an authoritarian is bad. Why does that need to be said?" It doesn't need to be said, but State Representative Kafia posted those words because of what happened, the debacle that happened to Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer this week in Washington, D.C. Now, many of you probably saw the debacle where Whitmer joined MAGA Republican House Speaker Matt Hall in the Oval Office this week to talk about funding to combat Asian carp in the Great Lakes and to provide funding for the Selfridge Air Force Base. And while, okay, those are things to talk about, the optics, on the other hand, looked downright awful. Why? Because Matt Hall looked like the leader of Michigan, while Whitmer stood mostly silent in the corner. The Detroit Free Press's Nancy Kaffer wrote an on-the-nose commentary after this debacle, describing how Trump made Whitmer look insignificant and small inside the Oval Office. And I agree with Kaffer. I do, because I think Whitmer got played and got played badly. And she also looked like she was playing Matt Hall's sidekick. Here's what Kaffer said. Trump signed a series of executive orders launching a criminal investigation of Miles Taylor, who served as chief of staff of the Department of Homeland Security in the president's first term for penning an anonymous op-ed in the New York Times. He then signed an executive order barring government agencies from enforcing regulations the president says are illegal or unconstitutional. He also signed another one, adding that the law firm Sussman Godfrey to a list of firms the president is punishing for representing his political opponents. Sussman Godfrey represented Dominion Voting Systems in a lawsuit against Fox News, which repeatedly aired inaccurate claims that Dominion had rigged the 2020 election. All of that happened, everyone. All of that happened while Whitmer was standing silent in the corner of the Oval Office. Right after, by the way, she gave a speech saying that while she didn't agree necessarily on Trump's tariff con, that they did agree on ways that we could maybe bring more manufacturing back into the country. You see, despite having a fascist leader in the White House, Gretchen Whitmer, like many in the Democratic establishment, say, no, let's try to find some common ground with those trying to destroy America. Whitmer's office now, of course, later put out a statement, and they had no choice because there was a lot of blowback happening right after that meeting, saying that in no way did the governor being there in the White House at the moment when he was signing all of those anti-democracy executive orders, in no way did that mean that she backed everything that he was signing. Oh, okay, well, you know what? You could have fooled me because she just stood there quietly, looking powerless. Now, the governor claims to love Michigan's grittiness, but when the spotlight was on her, she wilted. And she wilted quickly. She's backed down. She has backed down ever since the election, and I don't know who in the hell told her to capitulate and appear like a cheerleader for Dear Leader at times. I mean, she used to tell all of us how much of a danger he was to our country. But now here she is celebrating how she can find common cause with the man who not only tried to rob our democracy, but is hurting the very people she claims to represent, that is, Michigan's working class. You know, after that whole thing happened, I took to social media and I said, who's advising Whitmer to act like this? Or is this who she's always been? I don't get how being Clinton circa 1997 is going to help her brand. Come to think of it, what the hell is her brand? That's what I'm wondering. I mean, what is her brand? I don't get it. And that did get some reaction from some of you, and some disagreed with my sentiment, and that is fine. You can find what I wrote there on both Blue Sky and on Twitter. So look, I kind of get that perhaps Whitmer feels like she's providing Trump with some adulation, and maybe that adulation will help fund some more important programs like fighting invasive Asian carp and building some plants here in Michigan. And you know what? There is some truth. I'll keep it real. There's some truth that proclaiming Dear Leader to be all-knowing and almighty, it just might get you somewhere. But at what cost? Like Nancy Kaffer said in her Detroit Free Press post, if there's one thing Trump knows, at least, if there's one thing he knows, it's optics. And the optics of Gretchen Whitmer standing off to the side while Matt Hall took the lead by talking about how President Obama was to blame for Asian carps in the Great Lakes was unforgivable. Unforgivable. I can't believe she just sat there while Matt Hall was just going after the former Democratic president. She had nothing to say. It was turning into a campaign rally. Meanwhile, Trump's 25% tariff on foreign auto parts and cars is still in effect, despite him declaring a 90-day pause on some of his so-called reciprocal tariffs. I mean, that's still going to hurt Michigan. And by the way, since he did call for that pause, does that mean Liberation is now on pause? I thought Liberation Day was on April the 2nd, but now I guess it's on pause again. I don't know. I don't get it. There is no plan. Going off on that, Trump's declaring how we'll bring back clean coal. I mean, clean coal. It is a non-existent thing. It will destroy the environment. All right? It is destroying the environment. We are moving on from coal, and we are making some strides towards cleaner energy. But this is what Trump's doing while his administration also works on slowing down incentives on the EV car transition. Dear Leaders also yanked USDA funding that schools and food banks use to buy fresh products from small farms. And you know what? That will hurt Michigan farmers, not to mention, again, how farmers are also getting killed by these tariffs. And of course, there's the Trump regime's attacks on foreign students at colleges and universities across the state. Some 22 foreign students are being targeted at the University of Michigan to leave. 7 students from my alma mater of Central Michigan have been targeted. I mean, this is another way of the Christian Nationalist Heritage Foundation to hurt higher education. And yet, instead of using her time in the Oval Office to go on the attack and force Dear Leader to debate how his economic and anti-higher education directives are hurting her state, Whitmer just stood there. She just stood there, and to quote the late Ernie Harwell, like the house by the side of the road and watched it go by. Trump and Linda McMahon, by the way, the education secretary, they are threatening to pull federal funding from many schools if they refuse to get rid of their DEI. They're going after our state. And not one word from Governor Whitmer about that? Not one word? She just sat there in the corner. I read one response to my post stating how Whitmer may have felt like she was Lando Calrissian in The Empire Strikes Back, thinking that she had to make a deal, not a great deal, but she had to make a deal that would keep the Empire away for good. But we saw how good that deal turned out for Lando in the end, right? For me, I'll go with another iconic 70s movie as a symbolic take of what happened this week. To me, Gretchen Whitmer looked like that Senator Geary in The Godfather Part 2. I mean, in that movie, Geary tries to take on the Corleone family early on, but after they set him up in a way that only the family can save both his career and his prestige and his honor, he basically has to do whatever they say, and by the end of the movie, he just looks smaller than he was early on. Well, that's exactly how Gretchen Whitmer looked in the White House this week. That's exactly how Dear Leader's people and Matt Hall wanted it to look. They got exactly what they wanted. She walked into the trap voluntarily. And it got so cringeworthy at one point. Dear Leader asked if Whitmer and Hall got along, and she walked away from her corner for that 1 second, nudged Hall, saying, "We get along 70% of the time." She just admitted that she agreed with the MAGA Republican House Speaker most of the time? I don't get it, everyone. What is Gretchen Whitmer's brand? Moving the party further and further and further to the right wing? Do you think Governor Whitmer, of all those people marching and protesting across your state last weekend, that they were asking you to give more and more and more to the MAGA Republican Party? Is that what you were getting from everything that happened last weekend? Is that why you failed to show up and show solidarity with your people, Governor? Look, the 1990s are over, Governor. The people have seen how Clintonian politics led us to this awful place and gave us Donald Trump. I fear that all of a sudden Gretchen Whitmer is now part of this Democratic Party establishment problem that says we must appear moderate, we must appear level-headed, we must appear to be the technocrats. So that means we have to go a little further and further and further to the right with the MAGA Republican Party. How's that worked out for us, everyone? No, really, how has that worked out for everyone? I mean, our governor could be like Illinois Governor Pritzker, but no, it appears like she's choosing to be Trump's walking mat. That woman from Michigan, those days are long gone, and with it, so are her further political dreams and wishes, I'm afraid. But you see, this is how Democrats lose. And you know what happens when Democrats lose? The people lose. We need a Democratic Party to stand up for the working class. We need them to stand up for the working class for a change. I am hoping that Mallory McMorrow is watching Governor Whitmer on how not to act while MAGA Republicanism works on dismantling this country. I mean, the working class is in trouble, and no one with an operating brain cell believes that Elon and Trump are going to lift a finger to help the working class. I mean, we've got to rise up and fight against the spread of corporate authoritarianism that's sweeping across the country, looting the American people for their own gain. But that means we need leaders inside the Democratic Party to help fight back. To talk more about working class solidarity against this kind of right-wing fascism and corporate autocracy is Hamilton Nolan. Now, Hamilton's a longtime writer on labor unions and how the elites are taking it to the working class. He'll be on here to talk about ways to combat Trump's tariff con, the overtaking of our government by the corporate elites, and how MAGA Republicans are working every second around the clock on dismantling the labor movement piece by piece. That's all coming up after these brief words. You are listening to LOL.
It's the Left of Lansing podcast with Pat Johnston. Need to give Pat a piece of your mind? Or do you have some stories you think Pat should cover? Email him at leftoflansing@gmail.com. And if you have Michigan beer ideas for Pat, he'll love you even more. Now, here's Pat.
Remember to like and subscribe to Left of Lansing wherever you're listening now, and also on the YouTube. I'm putting up some video shorts on YouTube, and I even got some reaction this week to my latest one on what I call the Trump Tariff Con. But please subscribe to the show, because subscriptions really, really do matter for all of us trying to spread the good word of progressivism throughout the state of Michigan and throughout the entire United States of America. And you can follow me on Blue Sky, Twitter, Facebook, the Gram, and yes, as I said, on YouTube. If you ever want to talk with me about anything that I cover here on the show, leftoflansing@gmail.com is always the best way to go about it. All right, so let's continue to talk about what I call this Trump tariff con, because ultimately it's about enriching he and his corporate authoritarian backers while doing absolutely nothing to enrich the entire working class. As always, he'll use, little populist rhetoric, but his actions and policies like this tariff insanity shows how little that he cares about the working class that he has always claimed to support. And even more, MAGA Republicans, who also try to strike that same populist pro-worker tone, have shown they have zero interest in strengthening the American workers' position. Joining me to talk more about this and how to keep up our resolve to stand up against this kind of corporate autocracy that's taking over our country is Hamilton Nolan. Hamilton's a labor journalist for In These Times. He has his own site called How Things Work, which you can find at hamiltonnolan.com, and is author of the book titled The Hammer, Power, Inequality, and the Power for the soul of labor. Hamilton Nolan, thank you so much for spending a few minutes here of your busy schedule to be on the show here this week.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
Not much is really going on, really, that we could talk about, so I'm hoping that we can chew up some time here. But I'd like to just maybe ask you a few questions on your latest article that you posted on your site. And the article is titled An International Minimum Wage. And it's a spot-on analysis, in my opinion, of where progressives can kind of counter this Trump tariff con, because I feel like a few progressives and many Democratic office holders are having a difficult time in trying to create a cohesive counter message to Trump's tariffs, which are, of course, regressive taxes on the working class. Now, I live in Michigan. We Michiganders obviously understand how destructive trade deals like NAFTA were and how they weren't fair at all for the workers here, not to mention how many other so-called free trade deals did not improve the lives of Michiganders. But rather than calling for across-the-board tariffs, you argued that any future trade deal must include an international minimum wage. Can you explain this idea in further detail and how this would help workers in general?
Yeah, as you said, it's obvious that NAFTA era free trade has had very real negative impacts on working people, has juiced inequality a lot, made the inequality crisis worse in America. And the point I made, is just that, look, free trade was sold as something that will unleash a lot of new wealth, and it did, except all the wealth was captured by the investment class and the corporate class, and the working class got absolutely screwed. They lost their jobs, and the jobs that went overseas were poor jobs, and people are still poor. And so it was a poorly distributed benefits from free trade. And here we are with Trump, who is kind of grabbing the issue and claiming to be helping by his tariff policy, which is clearly insane and keeps on changing hour by hour and day by day. And the point I made is just like, look, you can institute an international minimum wage, which is an idea that has been talked about for many years. An international minimum wage would serve some of the same purposes that tariffs serve, which is to say it would make it more expensive for companies to offshore jobs by making them pay the workers that they're offshoring those jobs to a decent living wage, or at least better wages. So it has some of the same effects as tariffs in the sense that it disincentivizes offshoring jobs and removes some of that incentive to destroy jobs in America. But it has the added benefit of the benefits of the policy actually going to workers. It is putting more money in the pockets of workers. It is raising living standards for workers here and abroad. So it sort of serves somewhat of the same purpose as tariffs, but it directly attacks the problem of inequality and low wages in a way that tariffs don't. So this is just an example of the type of policy that progressives can get behind that addresses some of the issues of free trade without the insanity that Trump is doing with his tariff policy and the fact that it kind of creates a slush fund for Donald Trump also.
Yeah, exactly. And that is such a great point, too. And I think this would really get a lot of people from the working class to support this kind of an idea when you put it in that way of, look, this will, an international minimum wage would actually just go right into the pockets of the workers rather than a tariff that just goes right to the U.S. government or any government across the country, obviously. And I think that is, an important point.
Yeah, who knows where the money from tariffs is going to go in this administration. But yeah, it's pretty straightforward. Like you can say, well, you can close down the auto factory in Michigan and move it to Mexico, but you're going to have to pay the workers in Mexico the same as you're paying workers in Michigan. If you have that policy, for example, obviously they're not going to close down the factory because the only reason they're closing the factory is to pay poor people even lower wages. And so offshoring is all about exploiting economic desperation of workers in other countries, and it also devastates workers in this country. And by raising that floor for workers, no matter where they are, you remove that incentive of companies to do that.
You haven't heard many politicians actually suggest such a proposal. Obviously, MAGA Republicans definitely would never do that, but I can't say that I've actually heard really many Democrats. Maybe you can correct me on that one. Make such a suggestion either. I don't know if you saw it in the news today, but our governor here, Gretchen Whitmer, she made a speech today in which she said that she understood Trump's motivation on these tariffs. Now, while she said she didn't agree with how he was doing it, she was still trying to strike this tone that, okay, I understand it. I get why he might want to do something like this. However, she didn't really ever suggest what she would do differently to help protect and strengthen the American workers. Why do you think we're not hearing such an idea, a bold idea, but a common sense idea like that on the Democratic side?
Yeah, I mean, to advocate an idea like an international minimum wage, I mean, it's sort of, you have to have an internationalist perspective, which means to a certain degree forsaking the idea that America should economically dominate the world, right? And an international policy like that would have to be administered through international organizations, the International Labor Organization or the UN or similar organizations like that. Ceding power to international organizations to create more justice in the world is a good policy and a good goal, but even Democratic politicians don't want to do it because they still want to buy into the idea of America as the economic dominator of the rest of the world. And so I think that's why you don't see even Democrats tending to advocate policies like that, because Democrats are not really that much of a leftist party with a few individual exceptions. They don't want to cede power from it's like you don't hear Democrats advocating for the International Criminal Court either, even though that's clearly an example of like justice for all in the world. But their attitude is no, America has to dominate the world. And so that's why they can't really square that circle usually.
No, that's frustrating. There was one piece of news, though, that some Democrats, well, at least one Democrat, I think Bobby Scott, congressman from Virginia, and then, of course, Senator Sanders from Vermont, they did introduce a bill this week, right, to raise the minimum wage in this country?
Yes, there was a bill to raise it, I think, to $17 an hour over time. It's still, the federal minimum wage is still under $8 an hour, which is insane, obviously, and it's a lot higher on various states, some states, I should say. But, that's a policy that clearly should have been changed and updated a long time ago. And, it is pretty telling that Republicans have zero interest, in raising the minimum wage here in America, even while they're apparently willing to destroy the global economy to bring back crappy low-wage jobs to America. They have no interest in raising the minimum wage in the country that they actually control.
That just moves on to my next question, then, because you lamented in that same article something that has frustrated me as well. I just find that it's impossible for MAGA Republicans to celebrate these tariffs as a way that we're showing that we're sticking with the American worker, while at the same time they're doing everything in their power to weaken the American workforce. And you talked about that in the article. Can you go further in explaining that viewpoint?
Yeah, I mean, look, a lot of people have pointed out, you hear Republicans saying we want to bring back factory jobs to America, want to bring back manufacturing jobs to America. And I think a lot of people in America have a sense that, a couple generations ago, you could get a job in a factory and that would give you a middle-class lifestyle. It'd be a stable job. It was a job you could raise a family on. And so to some extent, it's natural that people look back on those jobs and they're like, oh man, we should bring those jobs back. Sounds like a good idea. But the fact is, what people really want to bring back is high union density, right? It was the strength of unions and organized labor that made those manufacturing jobs middle-class jobs in the first place. The unions were the ones who had the power to negotiate contracts that guaranteed those workers high enough wages and good enough benefits that they could raise a family on those jobs. So it didn't have anything to do with manufacturing itself. And if you bring back manufacturing jobs and factory jobs to America, at the same time you're trying to destroy unions, which is what the Republican Party does, those jobs are not going to be the great, sustainable, middle-class, solid jobs that they were a couple generations ago. So Republicans are playing a trick on people a little bit by pointing back to the past and saying, remember when these were good jobs, don't you want that back again? But they are not planning to bring back the power, the working class power that made those jobs livable in the first place.
Well, and, I remember back in the 80s, free trade deals were celebrated because they viewed them, especially the corporate class, viewed them as a way that we could get away and weaken those unions who they would argue back then were hurting the working class, right?
Right, absolutely. And I mean, a big motivation for companies to move those jobs overseas, in addition to wanting to pay lower wages, was to escape their unions, and that's the same reason why companies move from Michigan to Tennessee or to Mississippi. I mean, because they want to escape the power of the unions. And so it's just dishonest to act as if China is the enemy or foreign countries countries are the enemy because they're stealing our jobs. Like, that's not really what's happening. What's really happening is the corporate class is moving those jobs so they can keep more money and put it in their own pockets and pay workers less. That's what's happening.
Speaking of unions, what's your take on why UAW President Shawn Fain has decided to publicly back this Trump tariff war, even though, as you've pointed out many times and a lot of things that you have written here, how Trump and Republicans are doing everything in their power to weaken unions?
Yeah, I spoke to some people at the UAW trying to understand that myself. I think you have to give UAW the benefit of the doubt in the sense that they understand the auto industry and they are clearly not Trump backing type of union. I mean, they're a great progressive fighting union. I think that their point of view is that they have been obviously wrecked by NAFTA and free trade as badly as anyone in this nation. And they see the auto tariffs specifically. I think they would say not all of Trump's tariffs. I think they would talk very specifically about the auto tariffs and say, we see this as part of bringing back, turning around the damage that NAFTA did to the auto industry and to our members' jobs. So I think they're aware of the big picture. I'm not sure that calculation they're making, that they can kind of tread that line and be like, we're just going to back the auto tariffs, but not anything else that Trump is doing. I don't know that that's going to be tenable in the long term. I kind of think that the way Trump operates is he operates, you get a package deal. You get Trump or you don't get Trump. And I am a little skeptical that they as a union are going to be able to walk that line and say, we're going to oppose Trump on X, Y, and Z, but we're also going to sit down and negotiate a great auto tariffs for ourselves. So I'll believe it when I see it. But, if they can do it, good for them.
Yeah, I don't know. You brought up something, if you don't mind, just something you said earlier. I wrote it down and I want to make sure I ask you about it when we were talking about his tariffs. You said how this is sort of acting like Trump's personal slush fund, I think is what you said, or something like that. Can you explain that a little bit?
Well, I just mean that if you see how the Trump administration and the Trump family and Trump associates operate, obviously, this is the most corrupt presidential administration we've ever seen. That's not even a partisan statement, I think. I mean, the guy launched a cryptocurrency at the same time he had the United States government form a cryptocurrency reserve. I mean, it's direct types of corruption in ways that we have not even contemplated in past presidential administrations. And so when you see him acting as if the United States is a company that he runs and he is out to strike individual deals with every last company, with every last country about what their tariff rate should be, it's reasonable to wonder where all the money from these tariffs is going. It's reasonable to wonder to what extent these deals are affecting Donald Trump's own personal wealth and the wealth of the Trump family, where their investments are, how their own portfolios are going to be affected by all this. I mean, I don't know the answers to that, but those are extremely reasonable questions given the way that Trump and his family have already acted.
Of course, it's just documented history that he is transactional all the time, which is why, the oil and gas industry, they got a little carve out, didn't they, from these tariffs? And maybe that's got something to do that Trump was given almost $1 billion in campaign donations from that industry. Yeah,
I mean, he's clearly bribable, right? I mean, he's probably the most nakedly bribable president of my lifetime, for sure. I don't know about all time, but if you go back to Andrew Jackson, all that. But I mean, even at inauguration time, when you saw the CEOs behind him, and then you had CEOs going down to Mar-a-Lago and paying $1 million to eat dinner with Donald Trump and talk about their issues. I mean, those are bribes. Like, you can call it what you want, but the man is open for business.
Can I get your take on this? It is something I wrote on social media this week, and I just said that perhaps we're seeing why eliminating pensions and forcing workers in the 401ks wasn't as solid as right-wing economists promised us, because all it took was one guy to turn this whole system upside down. And it is scary, I think, for a lot of people to think that our whole system of government, democracy itself, or our economic system are apparently so flimsy because one person can do this.
Yeah, I mean, look, what populism, I would call it fascism. I think populism is kind of a polite term for what's going on. But I mean, what it does is it takes people's real, genuine grievances and problems, and it channels that into corrupt answers. So, I mean, retirement security, a very genuine worry for a lot of people. We have the option to strengthen Social Security, for example. Congress could do that with very little risk. And instead, they want to channel the money into 401ks in the private market. Why do they want to channel in the private market? So that Wall Street can take a cut. I mean, that is the only reason why 401ks exist. You can take the risk off of employers, and at the same time, you can give the financial industry a cut of people's retirement money. So everything that's happening under Trump is like a big billboard for why you cannot have power this concentrated in a democratic system. The whole thing is too prone to collapse.
One more question, because one of the reasons I'm letting everybody know, one of the reasons I contacted Hamilton to begin with was because he wrote an awesome article on his site called "They Are Going to Take Everything If We Don't Stop Them." And in that article, you are basically pleading with all of us to kind of wake up to the fact that Trump, MAGA Republicans, the tech bros, the corporate elite, they are just continuing to hammer away at the unions. And that started with just a couple of weeks ago. It seems like it was 2 months ago, but just a couple of weeks ago when Trump made that declaration that this government would not abide by any previous collective bargaining agreement that we had with federal unions. Can you talk just about that in a little detail and how this war against unions just doesn't stop with the public sector?
I cover unions. That's one of my primary beats. People may remember when Ronald Reagan fired the air traffic controllers in 1981. It was called the PATCO strike, and he fired about 12,000 air traffic controllers. And that was considered the worst thing that the federal government had done to unions in my whole lifetime, in at least the past half century, if not more. That was 12,000 workers that got fired. Trump, first, he ripped up the union contract covering 50,000 TSA workers. He just basically said, I don't care to recognize this existing contract anymore. And then after that, as you said, he came in with a negative order, which really should have gotten a lot more attention than it did, but said more than 700,000 federal workers, I am no longer going to recognize your union. I'm no longer going to allow you to have a union because I'm pretending that you're involved in national security, which was clearly bullshit. And so he essentially threw union contracts in the trash covering more than 700,000 workers. Now, that is 70 times worse than what Ronald Reagan did with PATCO. The writing is obviously on the wall. This administration is coming for labor union power, period. I mean, unions are one of the only things that were standing in the way of him carrying out his agenda. And so his solution was just to say, you don't have a union anymore. This is the biggest assault by the United States government on labor unions certainly since World War II. That is how bad and how drastic this move already is. And it's only been a couple months. He's just getting started. They're going to come for the federal workers first, and then they're going to come for all of the public sector workers, even down to the state level. You're going to see red states replicate the stuff that is happening in D.C. to the federal workers. And also, the administration is going to stop enforcing labor law. They're going to shut down the NLRB, which is the agency that enforces labor law. And what that means is that private sector companies, Amazon or every private sector company that has a union is going to be free to essentially retaliate against unions and ignore unions and break labor law because the government is signaling to them that they're not going to enforce it. And so this is a big assault on the entire labor movement that is coming right now. And it's really, really important that everybody who is in a union, who cares about unions, who would like to be in a union one day, or who cares about the working class in any way, shape, or form, recognize that we need to stand up and draw a line in the sand here before this gets worse and worse.
Are you optimistic seeing all of these protests that are happening across the entire country? It's only been, like you've mentioned, we're not even 3 months into this, that the people are kind of waking up pretty quickly and are trying to find ways to stop them?
Optimism is a choice, so I choose to be optimistic, but I do think it's true that those protests last weekend, huge protests, millions of people across the country, there is a huge sentiment among Americans to fight back against what's going on. Donald Trump does not have a majority of the country behind him. The people in D.C. who are carrying this out are a minority. Like, that is something that everybody should understand and recognize. Like, MAGA is a minority movement, and they're carrying that out against the majority of people. And so that is a powerful thing that we do have on our side, and at this point, I really think we just need to organize ourselves, and leaders need to stand up and lead people who have all that sentiment in effective directions to oppose what's going on.
All right, finally, before I let you go, can you just talk a little bit about your book that I mentioned at the very beginning called The Hammer?
Yeah, my book is called The Hammer. It is a book about the labor movement. It is a reported book all over the country, a lot of great stories of labor organizing, powerful unions, heartbreaking stories, inspiring stories. And it's about the potential of the labor movement to really be the key that fixes the deepest problems in America, and also why it hasn't done that yet, why it's broken in some ways. And so if you care about any of the stuff we're talking about, you probably find the book interesting, and it's for sale wherever books are sold.
Hamilton Nolan, you can find him at hamiltonnolan.com. Amongst other places, like I said, he writes for In These Times, and we just talked about his book called The Hammer. And people can find you on social media as well?
Yep, I'm on Blue Sky at Hamilton Nolan, and maybe have a leftover thing on Twitter as well, though I don't use it too much these days.
I get that. I get that completely. I'm doing the exact same thing. Hey, thank you so much for taking some time out here to talk with us on Left of Lansing, and keep up all the great work, and I'd love to have you back on if you'd decide to come back sometime in the future.
Absolutely, man. Thanks for having me.
This isn't a conservative podcast. We actually believe in freedom here, and we don't lose sleep over solar panels either. It's Left of Lansing with Pat Johnston. Don't forget, we're on YouTube now. Subscribe to us on YouTube or wherever else you get your podcasts. Tell Pat what you think of the show by contacting him at leftoflansing@gmail.com. Now, let's get back to the show with Pat Johnston.
Hey, thanks again to Hamilton Nolan for talking with us this week and for explaining the forces that we are up against and why Democrats need to stand up for the working class, or else the corporate class will continue to chip away at our safety nets while directing more and more power and more money back up to themselves. It's been happening here for 50 years, and if it doesn't stop, well, I'll provide links to Hamilton's blog and some of the articles that we talked about wherever you are listening to this podcast. Time now for the Left of Lansing Last Call. Last week, I was a guest on the awesome Michigan politically progressive podcast called The Point of Disorder podcast, which is Distill Social's podcast. And I'd like to thank Gina and Adrian for having me on and making me feel at home as we talked about politics in their cozy and also, may I say, professional studio. I am podcasting from my attic, and their studio looked really cool. So I had a blast there, and I can't wait to be on again sometime in the future. And Gina promised that she'll be on here later in the summer too. And please subscribe to the Point of Disorder podcast, because they do a great job of covering Michigan's political scene with not only a progressive viewpoint, but they'll also make you laugh a bit, which is something we all desperately need while the country is on fire. But I had a great time, so check out that episode from last week. But while I was on Point of Disorder, if you've heard the podcast, I may have lamented a bit about why I'm not seeing many young people, Gen Zers in particular, at all of these rallies that I talked about earlier on the show. And I do wish that I'd see more young people at these rallies. But, I thought about it, though, this week. That's not to say we aren't seeing young people protesting. I mean, for instance, we're seeing students protesting on college campuses while the Trump regime works on stifling and stamping out their free speech rights. But then I also had another thought. Because I saw something this week, and it made me consider, instead of concentrating just on Gen Z, maybe I need to focus on the shortcomings of my generation. Because a recent YouGov poll released this week how Gen Z voters have gone from a +5 to a -29 on Trump. They are leaving Trump in droves. Meanwhile, Gen X, my generation, is remaining as dear leader's most steadfast supporters. What? And I'm at a loss. I am at a loss, because how did we go from fight the power to F your feeling? I don't know. How did we go from the Breakfast Club to becoming Gordon Gekko and celebrating Gordon Gekko? How did we go from Rage Against the Machine to, hey, everyone, let's join the machine. Let's put the machine in more power. Look, I know that we grew up during Ronald Reagan, but I had hoped that we saw through the joke that was Ronald Reagan and the mystique of Reagan, especially since we had to live through some of the harsh recessions during the 80s and 90s. And also because of his policies, we also had to deal with the 2008 financial crash. So I was hoping maybe through all of that experience, we would become more progressives. Look, I get it that we watched movies like Die Hard, which ripped every institution imaginable, like government, media, power companies, multinational corporations, and large buildings. But as funny as Hans Gruber was, we didn't necessarily want Hans running our country. We grew up watching Back to the Future. But somehow we elected and continue to support Biff on being our president. Biff. How did we get to this place where we are attacking the very principles that we supposedly said we held? How did we grow up listening to Tupac and Public Enemy and then get to a point where we're supporting and celebrating the erasing of Black American history icons like Harriet Tubman and Jackie Robinson? How did we, as the first generation to really push for LGBTQ plus rights and to really be accepting of those rights, become the generation later on to push back against those same rights? How did we grow up with Sesame Street, but then later become the generation that's calling for the erasure of history and rights for marginalized Americans? How did we live through the Iraq War, the previously stated bankster-led economic collapse of 2008, the watching of corporate elite power grow and grow while working class power diminish? How did we go through all of that and say, the guy with a golden toilet, the guy who we used to always mock throughout the 80s and 90s, that's the guy who will be our savior? How did we do that? I mean, I don't get it. I don't have any explanations for it. And that's the scary part, everyone. I don't have explanations. So I'm sorry for what has happened with Gen X. I am. If you know and can explain exactly why Gen X has become more and more right-wing, please send me an email, leftoflansing@gmail.com. That's leftoflansing@gmail.com. I mean, how did we grow up from watching Bert and Ernie to getting to a point where we want to ban Bert and Ernie? Because, they live together.
You're listening to the Left of Lansing podcast. The music you're hearing is by Wanderbeats. To hear the latest project, check out Space Leopard on your favorite streaming site. Now back to our favorite progressive voice in Michigan. It's Pat Johnston.
That's going to do it for this edition of The Left of Lansing. Special thanks to Hamilton Nolan for being on the podcast this week. Thanks to all of you for your support and for listening to the show. If you think there's something that I should be covering here, or maybe you think there's a specific guest I should invite on the show, please email me, leftoflansing@gmail.com. We want to do the best job that we can at spreading the progressive message across Michigan and across the country. Okay, well, I have to take a little break and have an Oberon beer as we deal with this constant barrage of attacks against our democracy and economic survival. But remember, we become more powerful and influential in numbers. And if the Democrats are too scared and timid to fight on our behalf, well, then we will find some that are willing to fight for strong progressive values and for the working class, and who are not afraid to fight against and defeat MAGA Republicanism. Until next week, remember, take the battle to them. Thank you, Michigan.
The Left of Lansing podcast was produced by Pat Johnston, written by Pat Johnston, researched by Pat Johnston, edited by Pat Johnston, and hosted by, yes, Pat Johnston. Technical assistance by Dr. Heather. And thanks to our good friend Kirsten for the awesome podcast logo. Remember to visit leftoflansing.com for more news and information. Thanks again for listening to the Left of Lansing podcast.